I'm going to invite our guest speaker. Sorry, you were just halfway down, about to sit down. So I thought just before Bekah comes to speak to us in a moment, it would be good to get to know you a little bit and to introduce you to us. So if you could tell us a little bit about who you are, firstly, and where you've come from.
So my name's Bekah Legg, and I have come up this morning from Littlehampton. But my day job, I work for an organisation called Restored.
Okay, and what do Restored do?
So fundamentally, Restored does two things. So we're a Christian charity working in the area of domestic abuse. And the first thing we do is we have an online community, particularly for Christian women who have been through domestic abuse or been subjected to it, because they face a bunch of extra barriers to safety. They have extra questions whirling around their heads, and we create a safe space for them to ask those questions, to find information. We run recovery courses, drop-ins, reflective services once a week at lunchtime, an annual retreat, but we fundamentally just create this safe space for them. So we've got about 930 women in that network at the moment, at all different stages of life, all different stages of recovery, but we want them to rediscover who they are in God. We want them to be able to live lives of where they can live life to the full, and enable them to do that. So that's what we do. But off the back of that, what we now do too is we work with local church, because we recognise that what we do online is transformative. But sometimes local church doesn't understand or have the same level of understanding. And so we work and we have resources and training for churches, but we also have begun something called the Restored Beacon Network. And that's churches who choose to really purposefully partner with us to say, actually, we're going to talk about this stuff. Make sure it's not taboo in our space, and be a safe space for survivors in our church and in our community.
And do you think you have any people on your network who are based in Surrey?
I know that I do.
So, and are there people from that online community who are based in Surrey?
Yeah.
It's one of the things I think we assume in this, particularly in a prosperous and middle-class area like West Horsley, that yes, it happens, but it doesn't happen here. But the evidence is that it's happening everywhere, right?
It really is. It's it's one of those things where when you say the word domestic abuse, I would imagine we all have a picture in our mind of what that looks like. And that might be a certain type of person, a certain class of person who lives in a certain type of area. But the reality is domestic abuse knows no bounds, and it doesn't know class. It can happen to men, it can happen to women. And one of the things we've discovered through research is that it happens inside church as often as it happens outside, but it takes Christians 3 times as long to ask for help, which is really hard. So within our network, I've got a High Court judge. I've got, people who you might look more like you imagine, and I've got some pastors' wives, and I have, people from every part of society. And for some people, it's harder to come forward than others because of that stereotype that we have in our head.
Okay. I did find it dispiriting when you, just before the service started, you were mentioning that, and that you had over 900 Christian women on your network. So, it's important we have to. I remember thinking we did a teaching series in life pre-COVID, if anyone can remember that. But we used to talk about stuff we need to. I had a sermon series called Stuff We Need to Talk About, and we would talk about things like pornography. And I remember Peter Davies, one of our occasional preachers, I asked him to do a talk on domestic abuse. And it was quite sort of something for us to do, but we haven't done it for a very long time. So it's good that we're so grateful that you've come, and you are a person bringing hope to people and in difficult circumstances. And we look forward to hearing what you've got to say in a few minutes' time.
Brilliant. It's a pretty gruesome passage. And I won't ask you to put your hands up, but I wouldn't be surprised if nobody has heard it preached on in church before, because it's not very nice. And it should come with a trigger warning, shouldn't it? This might be too hard for you to hear. And we're going to talk about difficult stuff. But passages like this, as Phil said, are in the Bible. The Bible doesn't retreat from these stories that have happened in the life of his people. And so wrestling with them, trying to understand what they're doing there, I think is really important. So I'm going to take a little look at this passage and we're going to go through it, but I'm going to explain why it means quite a lot to me. And it's partly because I studied it in great detail when I was at Bible college. but it's also because it sits as the foundation of Restored's mission. So we have this mission to speak up about violence against women and to equip the church to stand against domestic abuse and support survivors. You could click on it, it's just there. But when you see those words, to speak up and then to do something, and we look at the last verse in Judges 19 that got read, which says this, next slide, it says, everyone who saw it was saying to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine. We must do something, so speak up. It's a highly unknown verse in the Bible, and it sits at the heart of the mission of the work of Restored, a call of God's people from this terrible story 3,000 years ago. It sits at the heart of everything that we do now. But let me go into that a little bit more. Let's go back to the story. Now, I sometimes talk about this story as a bit of a whodunit. And sometimes, if I haven't already had it read out, I would say, imagine this was a Netflix film. Imagine that it was a big crime drama, but one of those crime dramas that starts at the end, where you see the fallout, you see, the thing at the end, and then it traces back to the beginning to work out what happens. Because this story ends with something absolutely gruesome. These body parts that have been chopped up, probably not put into cardboard boxes with a Royal Mail stamp on the outside, but delivered to the 12 tribes of Israel. That's why this verse, just imagine, is spoken out as God's people have come together in holy outrage at what they've seen happen. They've come together because of what has been called out. And if we were to zoom back to the beginning of the story, we discover these two characters that lead us to where we get to. And I'm going to go back through the story quickly and tell it so that we can begin to think and imagine ourselves into it. Because it's Safeguarding Sunday. And I can imagine, again, I might be being a bit presumptuous, but Safeguarding Sunday might not excite you. It might not make you go, oh, I can't wait to get to church and talk about this morning. It's probably about as exciting as knowing we're going to talk about a story as the Levite and his concubine. But actually, it's all intertwined. It's all connected. Because actually, when we shy away from the tough stories, when we shy away from the harm in society, when we prefer to think it couldn't possibly happen inside these walls, this beautiful old church, I've just been admiring your paintings on the back wall because I can see them from here. Nothing like that could happen here. Well, when it does, because it can, then nobody notices, perhaps. Or people feel they can't say anything because it's not meant to happen here, only in other places with different types of people. And so it matters that we tell this story and perhaps we take time to imagine ourselves into the story. So let's take the story from the beginning to the end, because this story starts with these two characters, the Levite and his concubine. And there's something really important to notice at this point. So you may have been in church for years and have a very good idea of what these two words mean, but if you're not and you're new, then a Levite is a priest. A Levite is most definitely, at this point, a man. He's somebody who has all the standing of the vicar, of the priest in society. People come to him, they listen to him, they come to him for advice, they follow what he says. He's somebody who people serve, literally bring food, give offerings to, and make sure that he's okay. He has so much power that he can choose to use as he will. And then there's a concubine, which is a kind of secondary wife. All of the responsibilities, very few of the rights. And so we start the story with two people who fundamentally have quite an imbalance of power. Somebody has lots, and somebody else really doesn't have very much at all. And very swiftly we read that she leaves him, which actually, if you go back 3,000 years, is extraordinary. We live in a world of TV dramas and, women who've had 4 or 5 husbands and men who've had more women, and so it's less shocking to us. But if you go back 3,000 years, it would have been absolutely shocking that she left. At the worst, men might divorce their wives, but women didn't leave their husbands. There was so much shame attached to that to do it is huge. It's immense. And she goes back to her father's home. And surprisingly, he welcomes her in. We're going to come back to this a little bit later on. But surprisingly, he welcomes her in. And she's there for months. And depending on your version of the Bible, and when I say version, it's translation, because we have lots of different ones. It says that eventually this Levite gets to the place where he wants to come back and he wants to win her heart back. It actually says in the original Hebrew, which sounds quite romantic. And it sounds lovely. It sounds as if the priest has gone, do you know what? Enough time has passed. It's time for me to go and win her heart back. I will go and woo her. That isn't the actual words in the Bible, but it's the kind of sentiment. It's time to go back. And so he travels the journey with his servant and his donkey, and he goes to her father's house. And we have this little prolonged section in the middle where the dad keeps saying, no, don't go home yet. Why don't you stay another night? Have another meal. Sit down and talk. And actually, from this point on, we don't ever hear this woman's voice again. We know that she welcomes him, and then it goes quiet. She goes quiet. Maybe that's a part of the storyteller's angle, is he's trying to help us to notice that her voice has disappeared. Her voice started with a lot of agency, this great, big, huge choice to leave her husband and to go to her father's house. And then her voice goes silent, and the men take over the conversation. And he stays another night. And he stays another night. And we don't really know what's going on in the father's head at this point. Maybe he's trying to make up for the unfaithfulness of his daughter. Maybe he's a bit worried about his daughter. It's conjecture. We don't actually know. But eventually the Levite gets to the place where he says, no, enough food, enough sleeping. It's time for us to go home. And they begin this journey. But they don't make it home before nightfall, and they take shelter in the local town square. And eventually this man comes and finds them and says, you mustn't sleep out here. You see, the streets weren't safe 3,000 years ago, not even in God's nation of Israel. And so this man says, come to my house. You are welcome to stay there. And he lays the table, and he puts the donkey in with his animals, and everything looks wonderful. What a hospitable man. How wonderful to take in a stranger and his entourage and bring them in and provide them with safety. And this meal sounds wonderful. They were enjoying themselves until there's a knock on the door. And if this was a crime drama, this is the moment, isn't it, at which the tension would begin to build in the music. Frankly, it's the moment at which I would go and make a cup of tea, because I don't like those moments. When I can sense that there's a big bang or big threat coming, I don't like it. I either go and start looking at my phone or I make a cup of tea, but I try and let the tension go from myself because I don't like it. And we know that what happens next is horrendous. These men knock on the door, and the master of the house goes to the door and he opens it, and they say, send out the man, because we want to have our way with him. And it's really clear what they mean. It's really clear what they want to do. And the host, well, what a host. Absolutely not, he says. Don't do this vile thing. He calls it outrageous. In so many different ways, he calls out their desire as evil. Don't do it. It's outrageous. It's vile. He just prohibits it in so many different ways. And if you were sat inside that house, round the dinner table, you can imagine that everybody's bodies began to relax again after the fear of what the men outside were demanding. Their bodies would have begun to just go, oh, thank goodness that we've got such a good host. Until with his next breath, he says instead, take my daughter, take his concubine, and do whatever seems right in your own eyes. It says in some translations. In this translation, he said, do as you wish. I just want to point out, do as you wish. Not what's right, not because these girls are expendable. Do what seems right in your own eyes. But imagine being the women round that table as they went from phew to oh. Oh, we don't matter. The man was worth saving. The man couldn't be harmed. It was vile and outrageous. But for us, well, apparently we can be sacrificed to protect the men. We don't have the same value. We don't carry the same worth. We're not worth protecting. Imagine And it can only have been seconds and moments of that realization of how they counted. And here's the thing. The laws of hospitality in Israel 3,000 years ago weren't different for men than they were for women. God's laws of hospitality were the same for both, but something in the culture had shifted. Something had come in from outside that said, save the man, sacrifice the women. Something had changed. We'll look at what that was a little bit later on. And we know what happens next. We know that actually, mercifully, the daughter is saved because the Levite can't get his concubine out of the door fast enough. And he closes it behind her. And the Bible is quite kind. It's a horrible story to have had to read, but it doesn't go into lots of gruesome detail. It doesn't sensationalize it. It's enough to know that that woman was abused all night long and left for dead in the morning. And in the morning, I always hope he didn't sleep very well. But again, that's a question I don't get answered until heaven. But in the morning, when he wakes up and decides to set off on his journey with apparently no remorse, the Levite trips over her body on his way out, and he picks it up and he takes her home, and the rest we know about. As he bizarrely sends these parcels out to the tribes of Israel in some kind of outrage. It's an extraordinary, horrible story. And it's horrible to us now, but it was horrible to them then. You go back 3,000 years ago, and it's easy to set it as a different time and a different place, but it's a horrible story. Because God's people come together in this holy outrage. In verse 30, we see it. They say, has such a thing ever been seen or done? Has it ever been seen or done? We must speak up. We must do something. Like, nobody there thought that what had happened was the right thing. Nobody living at the time thought it was all okay. And, well, it's just the way that we treat women. Nobody thought that. They were horrified. Has such a thing ever been done ever since the time we came out of Egypt? Well, the thing is, it probably had. The book of Judges is an extraordinary book. And actually, it's a story that really documents the spiraling out of control of God's people. The book before it is the book of Joshua. And it's the story of God's people taking the land. And it's a story of them following God faithfully under a great leader. It's a story of them knowing who they are, knowing whose they are, knowing how to follow God well. And then Joshua dies, and the book of Judges continues the story as we see what happens. And there are so many stories within that we might know. Samson, Gideon, Deborah, all of these characters. But if you read the story from beginning to end and you look for it, you notice a theme. As God's people slowly but surely begin to spiral down, economically, politically, the way that they follow God first and foremost gets worse and worse and worse. And how they treat their women gets worse and worse and worse until we get to Judges 19, which sits really at the bottom of the pit of what happens when people stop following God, when a nation ceases to look to him. In fact, this story, this wider story, begins and ends with the same verse. I'll pick it up in Judges 21, verse 25. It's there earlier on before Judges 19 as well. In those days, Israel had no king, and all their people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. They had no king. Now, they didn't have a physical king, but here's the thing, they weren't looking to the king either. And they did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. And those are the words of the host of the house when he speaks to the men knocking on the door. Do what seems right in your own eyes. There's no suggestion that this is right in God's eyes. There's no suggestion that this is a story of God's intent. This is a story that reminds us of what happens in the world when God is removed, when we take away his goodness, when we take away his light, when we take away his kindness. And it's a story that points to the need for God. And it's a story that also shows us that God sees these things and he cares about these things. and he knows. And so for those of us who sit, and this story is uncomfortable because actually it presses buttons in us about our own past that might have been decades ago or more recent, God sees and he knows and he cares. But there is a bigger thing to notice in here as well, because these stories we put to the side, they're not in our children's Bibles, which is a good thing. They're not in the Common Lectionary, which may or may not be a good thing, but we don't like to look at them. And it's easy because we'd rather not think about these things. We'd rather cast these stories off as things that happen to other people in other times. A story that happens in a part of the world that actually we still think is a little bit barbaric. Or back 3,000 years ago, well, the way they lived back then was, I'm so glad that we're in a modern society. It's so easy to disconnect ourselves from it. But I want to just share some stats with you about the world that we live in today and why this story still matters. And I'm so sorry, that's my phone going off there, and I'm going to ignore it. But here are some stats. Here's the first one. In the last year, now this is from a couple of years ago, but it will stand still. In the last year globally, 9 million girls were forced to have sex. We don't know their names any more than we know the names of this concubine. Here's another one. In this country, across the world, 137 women are killed every single day by people who are meant to love them. If you bring that closer to home, in the UK, 2 women a week are killed by someone who is meant to love them. Fathers, husbands, boyfriends, brothers. You bring that in again. In 2021, there was a report out from the UN Women UK that said that 97% of women aged 18 to 24 will be sexually harassed. Not might be, not could be, will be. That's almost all of our young women will be sexually harassed. And that's on a scale from wolf whistles from the builders as you walk past right up to the worst of the worst of the worst. But it means that women live in fear because they don't know when the whistle is going to turn into the worst. They don't know these things. It's everyone. And in the same year, Ofsted did a bit of an emergency review of sexual abuse in our schools. And they said that our schools have a rape culture. And what that means is that sexual violence is so normalised that everyone just expects it and no one complains. When I shared these statistics with a group of students a number of years ago, and at the end, one of the girls came up to me. She must have been about 20. And she said, Bekah, what's wrong with the 3% of women who don't get sexually harassed? And a little part of my heart broke because I thought, I know you're talking about yourself, but that's really is the definition of a rape culture when you think that if you haven't been harassed, there's something wrong with you. I said, there's nothing wrong with you. That is a wonderful, wonderful thing that you have avoided it. There's nothing wrong with them. But in a culture where you expect it, you think there must be. And then if we bring it even closer to home, research we did 5 years ago, or 7 years ago now, suggested that 1 in 4 churchgoers have been subjected to domestic abuse. And of those, 2% were living in fear of their life. It's real. It's still real. It's an issue that happens behind closed doors. Sometimes it happens in plain sight. But so often we don't see it. And so often we don't know the names of the people. Sometimes we know the people. We just don't realise it's happening. And so thinking about how do we respond to that call of God's people to speak up and do something matters. And at Restored, that's what we do day in, day out. But what does it mean for you? Well, the first time I ever preached on this was shortly after the murder of Sarah Everard. And shortly after the murder of Sarah Everard, there were vigils out on Clapham Common and in all kinds of places as people were so outraged that this girl was just walking home. And yet she'd been kidnapped and killed by a policeman, it turned out. And we wanted the world to change. We couldn't believe that this is still a world that we live in where the streets aren't safe at night, where girls can't walk home in safety. And so we can think about doing something gigantic like that, but actually we can bring it back to just who we are and the everyday things that we do. You see, these behaviours that we see in domestic abuse, the behaviours that we see in the big, fat, scary things and the terrible headlines that we see, well, those are just like fruits on a tree. In fact, there's a domestic abuse expert who works with perpetrators who says that really it's like fruits on the tree, and you can cut them off, but they'll just keep growing back, because what matters is the root system. And that sits fundamentally in our worldview. And it sits fundamentally in how we think the world works, and what matters, and who matters, and what we're entitled to, and what other people are entitled to. And actually, this man, his name's Lundy Bancroft, but he's not the first person to talk about fruits on the tree. Jesus talked about it. Paul talked about it. But Jesus said, just as you can identify a tree by its fruits, so you can identify people by their actions. Another friend of mine says, you don't abuse people that you respect, and you don't respect people that you abuse. So how do we tackle what we think about? How do we start to tackle the culture that creates it? Because fundamentally, this behaviour comes out of a sense of entitlement. I should be able to have what I want when I want it. And you don't really matter. I matter. It's about this culture of individualism that we live in society. It matters about the conversations that are had in the locker room and in the pub and in the workplace and with our kids, the things they're hearing on social media. What are we talking about? And we notice it, how these outside culture infiltrates all over the place. We can see that in Israel 3,000 years ago, an outside culture that really did say men were more important than women had infiltrated into the culture of the nation of Israel. But it's continued since then. Now, I said I studied this when I was at college, and I did, but I want to show you something. I really did go and do a big old deep dive. So I want to, actually, if we can go on to the next slide after this, I want to show you something. You see, when we had this passage read to us at the beginning, we heard that this woman was unfaithful to her husband and went back to her father. But actually, the different translations say some very, very different things. Can we go forward again and again and again and again? And that'd be grand. Perfect. Because depending on the translation of your Bible, or even the year in which it was written, this verse looks very different. So we had the middle one. We had the NIV. And there's an understanding here that she was unfaithful. Now, it's possible she was just unfaithful by leaving and that she hadn't necessarily done anything else. But actually, if we look at the NRSV, it just says she was angry with him and left. And if you look at go back to the King James Version, well, it says she was a whore. Those are very different versions of a story. And they changed the story. Because if she was a whore, which is a word I don't like saying in church, but if that was the case, and this is all, we could see this story as a cautionary tale of what happens to bad girls. If you misbehave, terrible things will happen to you. In fact, middle ages, not middle-aged, I don't know how old he was, but a theologian from the Middle Ages said this is a story of divine punishment for a woman who didn't know how to behave. And so I really did dig into what's happened, because if she was angry with him, well, then maybe that's a story about somebody whose husband's behaviour was so bad that even though it was unusual to leave, she left and went back to the safety of her father's house. And maybe that's why her dad didn't want to let her go and was nervous. And then actually, this is just a story of a woman who's been wronged from start to finish and not protected by the people who should have protected her. And here's the thing, we don't entirely know. But actually, if you go back to the original Hebrew and back to the original Greek, it's complicated. Because you end up with this original, the very original is lost, and then you get the Greek, and then it translated back into the Hebrew. And the word that's used is very hard to be sure of what it means, because it's not used anywhere else. But if you go back to some of the early church fathers and their telling of this story, there's one called Ambrose. And his version is, well, she was angry with him and she left. So you have to sit there and go, well, it's really hard to base your whole theology on a word that no one's really entirely sure what it means. So you have to start setting it into context. Well, Israel's laws were very, very clear about what happened to adulterous women. And they didn't get accepted back into their dad's house. And husbands didn't usually want them back. They normally got stoned. So if we put it into context, if we understand the time that was being lived in, then actually the version of this story that makes the most sense is that she was angry with her husband and she went home. And it might be that that's been translated as unfaithful. In fact, it's very likely that it's been translated as unfaithful because it was so unheard of to leave your husband. It's unfaithful to leave. But the whore only came into the Bible in the Middle Ages. Because this is an uncomfortable story. And it's much easier to make it her fault than have to wrestle with the reality of a world where actually sometimes people are treated terribly. We feel safer in a world where we can victim blame people and say, well, if she hadn't have been wearing that skirt, if she hadn't have had so much to drink, if she'd have just not made him angry, if she'd have just cooked a better dinner, if she'd have not taken that job that emasculated him, if she hadn't have done those things, I think that this woman is the victim of victim blaming. The story got changed to make it her fault so that we didn't have to think about the fact that actually sometimes the behaviour is just wrong and we need to wrestle with that. But this story could have been so different. It could have been such a different story. As we think about it in the light of Safeguarding Sunday, so much could have been different. Because we can sit there and go, what if that Levite had trained? Now I'm being a bit anachronistic here, but what if he changed in a Bible college that absolutely drove home the value of men and women made in God's image, of God's original intention for the relationship between men and women? What if he'd been taught how to use his power well? What if that father had felt empowered to say, do you know what? She's staying with me. I don't want her to come home. I don't think she's safe. What if the schools in Gibeah had run really good programs helping young men and young women know how to have healthy relationships, had to know how to contain themselves, to understand that other people need respect no matter who they are, that your carnal urges can be controlled. You're not entitled to have them met. What if there'd been a system where that woman could have gone and asked for help? People who would have listened and said, I know it's unfaithful to leave your husband, but you deserve safety. What if? It's why when we feel frustrated that it's time to do the safeguarding videos again, when we've got to do the training, the next level of training, or the module on domestic abuse, and we think, oh, for heaven's sake. It's why it's worth doing, because that's how we create a culture of safety. It's how we create a culture that says, not in this church, and if it is happening in this church, then you can tell us. You can ask for help, and you will find support. It's how we get to a place, like that verse